This is a classic predictive analytics task, looking for some category that's more likely to do something than the general population is. The reason this is important is if you've ever heard of the 80-20 rule, which says, for example, 80% of my profits are due to 20% of my customers, or 80% of my repairs need to be done on 20% of the components. Think of your own interest. Do you have any 80-20 rules in what you're looking at? The reason you want to do the prediction is if you can find that 20% ahead of time, you can focus your limited resources on it, and there's huge payoffs in that. This is data that was collected by a Portuguese bank to evaluate their marketing efforts. You'll notice that it's in a normalized form. This is set up to be used for data mining exercises, machine learning, and not coincidentally, that's the same as our normalized form. Each row is a customer. You'll see there's more than 4,000 entries here. It's a much bigger file than we've looked at so far, but actually this is just a tiny part of the entire file. And you'll notice there are several attributes, starting off with some demographic data and ending up with whether or not they signed up for the marketing campaign. Even though the bank is focusing on marketing, there's something else interesting here that we might want to study. What are the characteristics of these people who've gone into default? The better we can understand that, possibly as a decision maker in the bank, we can avoid some of these defaults, either by doing a better job of screening people for loans or helping people before they actually get into financial trouble. But just looking at this, here we have it filtered. We're in the bank spreadsheet and it's filtered, so we're only looking at those where it's yes for default. And we don't see any particular patterns. So the differences are going to be subtle. They're going to be hard to find, but it's worth our effort to do it as a decision maker in the bank. Now let's clear this filter so that we can look at the whole thing. So this looks like a job for pivot table. Now the first thing to ask yourself when you're doing a pivot table is, what's your key outcome? And of course here it's whether or not they're in default. This is the thing we want to predict. This is the thing we want to understand. How does this relate to the other characteristics? But in many cases like this, it's a yes or no. It's not numerical as it was when we were doing the spending analysis. A lot of decisions are like this, where the main outcome you're interested in is yes or no. Was the job completed? Was it paid? Did the person buy the product? Questions like that. Take a moment and think about some of the questions that you have that you might want to do analysis on, you may have data on, where the outcome you're most interested in is not numerical, but it's yes or no. And we talked a little bit about how to handle that. And that was you code yes as 1 and no as 0. And then you can do a lot of things in pivot tables that you couldn't do before. As you recall, yes, no, which are categories. All you can do with that is count. And all it does is count things that are not empty. It doesn't distinguish the yeses from the nos. So that's one thing that we're going to want to do before we start looking at this and making our pivot table. The other thing we might notice is that we've run into before is age is not a category. It's numerical. It's almost continuous. And you've seen before, if we try to make a pivot table with a characteristic like this and use this as one of our rows or columns, we get so many rows or columns that you can't make any sense out of it. So what we'd like to do is put the ages in bins to categorize them, to turn age not into a number but into a category. Keep in mind, what pivot tables want is they want the output, that value that goes in the lower right corner, they want that to be a number, and everything else should be a category. Now before we saw how to do that, how we could take age and we could group it using grouping. Sometimes though, you're given particular groups ahead of time, and that's the case here. We have particular age groups we want to put them in, not necessarily equal size. Same thing for balance. We want to be able to distinguish positive and negative and zero balances. And we have categories for that. So later on you'll see how to do that. But right now, let me show you the results of doing that. So let's take a look at what this looks like once we finish it. And now you see our bottom line, which we've moved to the end, the thing we're most interested in. There's one. There's one. So those few people who have defaulted, we want to see what distinguishes them from all the others. So now you see this is your value, and it's numerical. All of these other columns are categories with just a few values. So we're going to get some nice pivot tables. Okay, we're ready to start slicing and dicing this data and looking for what characteristics best define those likely to go into default. This is going to be your challenge. Find some combination of characteristics that are more likely to go into default. We're going to do Insert, Pivot Table, and we're going to put this on a new worksheet. It's selected what we want. Make it a little bit bigger. The first thing you do, of course, is put your key outcome under values, and that is whether or not they're in default. Remember, that's ones and zeros. And here we get the sum. Now what it's adding up is all those ones and zeros. And the zeros don't contribute anything, so it's counting the number of ones. It's counting the number of customers who have gone into default. Something else we could look at, in fact, let's bring it in here again so we can look at them side by side. We could look at count. Okay, what does that give us? Count, as you recall, counts the number of non-blank cells. And of course, that's all of them. We've got 4,521 customers. That's what it's telling us. The other thing we can do, bring in another default down here. And we will do average. This is surprisingly useful. It's averaging the ones and zeros. And in this case, we have very few ones, and so we get a small number. And this actually makes more sense if we change it into a percentage number format. Percentage. Okay. 1.68%. That's really the number we're interested in, because that says out of all our customers, 1.68% of them went into default. Now your job is going to be to find some category with a much larger number there. So let's see what we can do. Let's try age. And we're going to use that as the rows since we've got these three different things as columns. Now if we look at these percentages, we see over 70, 0%. That's really good. Nobody in that category defaulted. So that may be a very reliable group to loan to. And then coming down here, we find under 25 is very high. Now, if you're a decision maker at the bank, you may say, well, maybe I need to do something to help people who are under 25, who are just getting started, who don't know a lot about finance, maybe have some counseling or some classes or some literature for them. However, if you look at the count column, you'll see there aren't a lot in either one of those categories to make it worth our trouble as a decision maker at the bank to do something special for that particular group. One thing you might want to look at is marital. This is kind of hard to look at. I think we've already looked at age. Let's just look at marital by itself. And we see that divorced is very high. It's about twice as much as the general population. This is actually a fairly large group. There's 528 out of your over 4,000 customers who are divorced. And by the way, this also includes widowed. And that indicates maybe the bank would like to provide them some support. They're going through a financial transition, and the bank can give them some information, some counseling to help them get through that. So there's a class that you might have found. Let's see what else we might want to try. How about job? And looking down here, we see some that are fairly high: unemployed, self-employed, and entrepreneur is really high. There are, remember this count is the number of people in this category. So there are 168 entrepreneurs, and 7 of those are in default. So much higher average than the general population. As a decision maker at the bank, that might suggest to you that you're being a little lenient in offering loans to entrepreneurs. They're probably pretty good at talking about huge profits to come and so on. They're generally optimistic, possibly overly optimistic, about their financial future. So we may need to be a little more skeptical when loaning money to entrepreneurs. So those are a couple things that I found. Again, I'm interested in what you found and what it would mean to you if you were a decision maker at the bank. What kind of conclusions can you come up with? Please put it into the comments if you'd like.